Welcome to Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Robert Lucas, the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1995. Bob, welcome to Econ Talk.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I want to start our conversation talking about growth. You wrote about some of the puzzles of growth in your 2002 book, Lectures on Growth, saying that once you start to think about them, it's hard to think about anything else. Well, I can relate. What I'd like you to do first is tell us about some of the stylized facts that got you thinking about growth, what we know, and then we'll turn to some of the puzzles and how we might explain them.
Sure. I mean, what I meant by it's hard to think about it, I was after giving some statistics on the differences in living standards when you compare the richest to the poorest countries in the world. At that time, it was on the order of, say, a 20 to 1. You know, the average American income per capita in the United States would be about 20 times income per capita in India. It's hard to measure per capita income in very low countries. So that could be 30 to 1 or 15 to 1, but there's a huge gap in living standards between the very rich and the very poor. And the question is, where did this gap come from, and what can be done about it?
There's also that's a gap in the levels.
Right.
You point out with some care in your book the importance of distinguishing between levels and growth rates.
Right.
The growth rates are also different.
Right, but if they weren't, the levels wouldn't have been. If you go back to the 18th century, let's say, living standards in Asia and in Europe were pretty close. Maybe there was a little edge to the Europeans, but people were getting on the order of 600 or 500 U.S. dollars worth of income per year on average in China, in England, in wherever. Maybe there's a difference. Again, these figures aren't measured without error, so maybe there are 2 to 1 differences, but nothing on the order of 15 or 20 to 1. So what happened since the 18th century is the Western Europe and countries like the Americas that are occupied by Western Europeans started to grow at a sustained level, and Asia and Africa just sat there. So over the years, the income gap has just widened and widened and widened.
So we'd like to
So economic growth is the reason why the levels, the countries with high incomes today are the ones that enjoyed 2 centuries of economic growth, or maybe even 1 century or half a century if you think about South Korea or Japan. But they've been growing for a long time, and that's how they got rich.
So economists have been trying to understand these questions going back to at least Adam Smith. But in the last part of the 20th century, from the 60s on, economists tried to build formal models of these both differences in level and differences in growth rates.
Right.
In some of those early models, there was an expectation that the gaps would narrow in a natural way, the idea of convergence. Can you talk about what the intuition was behind those models and why they may have been disappointed in those predictions?
Yeah, I'm not sure how I would characterize in the 60s when growth theory was born, modern growth theory was born, I would characterize it a little bit differently. Robert Solow was the leader in this, the MIT economist, designed the first growth models in the sense of a differential equation that you could actually solve out that would give you a growing time path of income. But he was trying to think about the growth rate in the successful economies, the United States, the UK, Northern Europe. And then the idea was that the poor countries would have to do a lot of centralized in order to get into the situation where a solo model would even apply. They'd have to sort of plan their way out of poverty. That's what people were looking toward this Russia, the Soviet Union, as a model. So I don't think that people were appreciating that there was a natural tendency for the poor to catch up with the rich. On the other hand, I think they thought there was a lot of explicit government policy that was going to needed to make that happen. And so there were sort of two branches of growth theory: one to deal with the successful countries, which focused on free markets, and another branch of theory to dealing with the poor countries, which was largely focused on centralized planning.
I guess I was thinking of the idea that if you look naively at in 1960 between rich and poor, rich countries, and it's still true today, have more capital,
right,
more technology, more machinery, more equipment,
right,
that makes the average worker more productive. And some people speculated that, well, there was such tremendous opportunity in these poor countries, capital would inevitably flow to its higher return
right,
in those poor countries. So
well, that's what Solo's theory says if you take it literally, that's for sure. I don't know if he was willing to follow out that implications, but other people were. Diminishing returns, the law of diminishing returns just means that any resource is got a higher return where it's most scarce. So that means that capital, equipment, skilled labor should be getting much higher returns in the poor countries where they're scarce than in the rich countries where they're abundant. If that were true, then you'd think that skilled people and capital goods would migrate from the U.S. and Europe to the poor countries. But nothing like that happens.
It happens a little bit. It happens a little bit, right? We build American multinational companies build factories in those poorer countries.
Okay,
but it doesn't transform.
That's happening now. That's true.
It doesn't transform their standard of living. It helps it a little bit, perhaps.
Oh, it helps it a huge amount. But at least that's what's going on in mainland China now, at a very large scale. I'm not saying you don't see this tendency around, but if it were strong enough, this huge income gap wouldn't have emerged in the first place.
Right. So there must have been either barriers to that capital flow or some subtleties in the returns that are not easily measured or observed.
Right.
You raised the idea of the obvious example is corruption or insecure property rights might keep an investor from moving capital to a low-income country, but that can't be the whole story.
No, I think there's plenty of poor countries that have, feudal economies which are run by the wealthy and have very secure property rights, and nothing happens. It's not a sufficient condition for economic growth, but it certainly is a necessary condition. I mean, you're not going to put an investment in a country if it's going to be nationalized or confiscated next year. You
talked before we move on. I want to emphasize the point you made a minute ago about China and the incredible transformation in China in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah.
There is an impression out there, and we talked a little bit about this on this show when I interviewed Robert Barrow.
Mm-hmm.
There's an impression out there that somehow the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer,
mm-hmm.
and the international global trading scheme is designed to exploit the poor countries. Yet the data are very clear, as you point out in your book and in an essay at the Minneapolis Fed that we'll put up on the web. You point out very clearly that poverty is declining.
Every serious student of economic growth knows that. That's not even controversial. Yeah.
It's not controversial among serious students of economics. It may be more controversial among the average American or average listener.
Maybe.
So when we talk about this extraordinary explosion of inequality or the gap between high standard of living countries and low standard of living countries, it is still the case that the low standard of living countries in the last, say, 40 years have improved their standard of living tremendously.
Oh, for sure. I don't think the growth of the West came at the expense of Africa and Asia. But it's only recently that it's starting to be shared in by Asians in a big way, and someday it will be in Africa too, I hope.
Yeah. Now going back to this evolution of economics and the way it looks at growth, sometime in the last 40 years, maybe about halfway through, economists started looking at what we call human capital.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of looking at physical capital of machinery, we looked at some measure of skill embodied in people rather than in machines, called technology or knowledge. Talk about how you think about that and how your thinking on that and the professions has changed over time. Because it's very complex. It's a very rich and difficult to pin down idea.
Well, let me go back to Solow's work in the 1950s in the original growth model. And what Solow found was the model was set up to focus on the accumulation of physical capital. And so he wrote down equations describing a model in which physical capital accumulation was possible and increased productivity. And the key implication of this model was that the growth rate of that economy would slow down and keep slowing down until it equaled the rate of population growth. So per capita incomes couldn't grow perpetually in an economy where growth was driven by physical capital only. And the point is, again, it's the law of diminishing returns, that each additional unit of capital is adds less and less to productivity than the preceding units. And at some point that catches up with the system. So you can't focus the theory of growth entirely on physical capital accumulation. So it's something else. What is something else? It's knowledge, technology. If you just think about it, everyone knows that we can do all kinds of things now, and that people didn't dream of 20 years ago or 100 years ago. And the machines we can build get better and better, and that's because it is human capital. The terms knowledge, human capital, they're all kind of synonyms the way I see it. They all mean pretty much the same thing, and they mean just what I said. We need something besides physical capital accumulation to account for this sustained growth in living standards.
So in the Solow model poisoned, I think, a lot of economic development because it said, at least this is the way William Easterly talks about it in The Elusive Quest for Growth, that somehow if physical capital was the source of growth, which is what was the original model, physical capital is the source of growth, what we need to do is invest in machines and equipment in the poor nations, and then they'll get rich.
Right.
That didn't happen. No, we did a lot of those investments. We spent a lot of money. They spent a lot of money, and we helped some of it. It didn't pan out. So that encouraged people to take a different approach. But the way I think about this puzzle of human capital, and I know you've thought about this, I'd like your thoughts. The stock of human capital is pretty widely available, and in fact, that's really the essence of it. You talk about in your book the body of knowledge that is generally available for access by suitably prepared people. Mm-hmm. What Kuznets called the stock of useful knowledge.
Right.
That stock of useful knowledge is widely known around the world, right?
Well, the qualifier suitably prepared people is essential. I mean, think about, just to take an example, the American physics profession in the 1930s. I mean, in the 1920s, America was nowhere. Somebody wanted to get a real training in math or physics would go to Germany, where physics was happening. In the course of the 1930s, as the Nazis sort of destroyed the scientific life of Germany, more and more of these physicists came over to the United States, and that's when the U.S. started getting on the map. Our current dominance in physics started then. Now, you could get there were plenty of German-speaking American physicists in the 1920s. It only takes a couple of weeks to mail a physics journal from Germany to, Cambridge, Mass, or Chicago. So, I mean, the knowledge is there in a way, but you don't get to the frontier of an art or a science or anything by reading books. Everybody knows that. You have to go and interact daily with people. That's why painters went to Paris in the 19th century. That's why they went to New York in the 1950s. You can see this in any field. So it's not a simple matter to tap into the world's knowledge if you're talking about the frontier of scientific knowledge.
Right, that's a profound thought. I love what you say in your book. I should mention to our listeners, the book we're talking about is Lectures on Economic Growth that came out in 2002. It's a very technical book in parts, but an untrained reader would profit from reading the non-technical parts and just skipping the equations. But there's a great deal of formalism. It's a wonderful book for a graduate student or a very skilled undergraduate, but even a thoughtful untrained person would benefit from it. But in that book, you talk very provocatively about Jane Jacobs,
Yeah.
and her understanding of cities as places where some of these synergies take place.
Right. I think she's got a very good sense of it.
In a non-technical way, but still insightful, right?
Yeah, very insightful. And one of the things that you get from Jacobs, it's easy to focus on famous examples like painters or physicists, the kind of high art or high science end of things. But Jacobs talks about, the woman who invented the brassiere, Ida Rosenthal, who started Maidenform bra. She was a seamstress who wanted to make her customers look good in the dresses she was. So there's all kinds of innovation taking place in every field, and it doesn't have to be people with PhDs. It's not high science. It's just people who are trying to get richer, and they're trying to get richer by doing something good for their customers.
I want to bring up another example used in the book, which I found extremely interesting: the Liberty shipyards of World War II.
Uh-huh.
Extraordinary increases in productivity that took place over a very short period of time in the building of these warships at a time of crisis.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what might explain that. How, people, it's not like they suddenly brought in, Pedro Martinez to pitch for the team instead of me.
Yeah.
The people who were doing this were pretty much the same people, and yet over a very short period of time, they got almost unimaginably more productive, twice as productive.
Well, they were new people. I mean, the shipyards. I lived in Seattle at that time, and in fact, my dad had moved there to try and get it. He was unemployed and wanted to get a job in the shipyards, and he got a job as a welder, which he had no experience at, and they accelerated the apprentice program. So, I mean, in a year, he was a expert welder. So that's a steep learning curve, and I think lots of people working in the shipyards have been drawn in from other occupations. There was 10 or 15% unemployment in many regions of the United States still in those days in 1942, and every day was a learning experience for them.
But I suspect, and I'd like your thoughts on this, I'd suspect that some of that knowledge, some of the improvement was not in the skills of the hands of the workers getting more accustomed to doing what they were doing.
Right.
But what you might call a Hayekian organic, the production of the knowledge, that people learn things about where the rivets should go and what he calls the particular knowledge of time and place.
Okay, well, my dad was a welder, but there's managers of all kinds and naval architects and a lot of people at all levels involved in making a shipyard go.
And how that work was organized was probably an evolutionary process. They didn't have a blueprint on how to do it at first, and they must have learned a great deal on the job.
Absolutely.
That was institutional rather than just an individual.
Yep. But again, you were talking about having access to the world knowledge frontier. This happened to happen over and over again for each shipyard. When they opened up a new yard, their productivity levels would start low. It wasn't like they could just spend a couple of days hanging out in a successful yard and then implement those policies in a new yard. A whole group of people had to get on board, and learn how to work together to achieve this objective of a highly efficient shipyard. I think that's true anywhere too.
But let's take that to the international level now. I'll give you a puzzle that I think about a lot, kind of trivial, but maybe not. A chicken in America lays about 350 eggs a year because it's in an extremely productive capital environment of nutrition and medicine and everything to keep that chicken alive and as productive as possible.
Okay.
A third world chicken is scratching around in the backyard the way they scratched around in America 50, 100 years ago.
Right.
And it lays 50 eggs a year. So an American chicken is 7 times more productive than a third world chicken.
Oh, I never seen that statistic before.
Pretty cool, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's part of the reason eggs are cheaper now than they were 50 or 100 years ago in America. But here's the puzzle. The technology of how to make a chicken lay 350 eggs, you don't have to go to the physics department in Chicago or the shipyard. It's the people who have that equipment would be thrilled to sell it to you in Indonesia or Malaysia or Vietnam.
Right.
But they don't use that equipment. They have high levels of labor.
You're right.
So they use labor-intensive methods of production, of wandering around in the backyard and seeing where the eggs are, rather than a hen house that organizes the eggs and rolls them down after they're laid using gravity, et cetera, et cetera. What's going on there?
Well, labor is cheap there, so the reward to economizing on labor for an American farmer is huge because most American farmers have pretty good city jobs and take care of the farm on the weekends. So the opportunity cost of their time is very high. You go to China, in the countryside, you see people outside working all the time. You can drive from one end of Illinois to the other and never see anybody outdoors. Those farms seem to but Illinois farms are much more productive.
So the puzzle to me is that the knowledge of how to make productive chickens or productive almost anything is widely available. It's just not one source of these differences is the profitability of adapting those technologies, right?
Yeah.
And the returns to labor and capital and investment in those countries. I guess it comes back to our original puzzle. If you were going to start an egg farm, you'd think you'd put it somewhere where it's most productive. For America, it's here.
Yeah.
It's not in China to then ship the eggs back across.
Well, eggs, I guess, suppose are hard to ship, but
more generally.
But it seems to me the way you're describing it, Chinese wage rates are going up at a pretty good rate. So it won't be that long before the salesman of this egg equipment is going to start making some sales in China and Thailand and so on. I'm sure that's why they're over there now working that territory.
So in this,
it'll happen, but it's got to be economically, as you know, worthwhile to make it happen.
But the weird thing is they can't just jump. You talk in your book about the painting in your hallway, which is not unrelated to the point we're on. Can you talk about that and what it tells us about returns to work in the land with various types of equipment?
Well, this is just a painting of a farmer working his land and beautiful scene, some fruit trees. It's a spring painting. He's plowing. I just was saying that this kind of traditional agriculture that could have been any century in the last 100 years. It's like this way of life was not one in which there was any ongoing progress in living standards. And you certainly couldn't say that about farms in America now. You'd still say it about farms in southern Mexico or parts of South Asia. People are working exactly the way their great grandfathers did. That's the way the world used to be.
So, how are they going to get from there to here? What process?
It's not going to happen in the villages or the farms. It happens in the cities, just like Jane Jacobs. So people any 18-year-old in China would be given anything to get to Shanghai or Beijing, anything to get off the farm. He's got schools, he's got skilled people and all kinds of trades that he can learn from. There's it's a place with a future. Feudal agriculture, same thing with southern Mexico. Those guys would give anything to get to Mexico City and even more to get to Chicago, and a lot of them are doing it. Not because they're trained for work in Chicago, but because they'll start the training when they get here. Learning from the migrants who came in last year, and they're helping to speak English, help them find jobs, help them to learn how to do the jobs. So I think economic growth is always associated with a movement out of agriculture and into the city environments.
Well, let me ask you a naive question about that. That Mexican 18-year-old that you were talking about who comes to Chicago, legally or illegally,
right?
And let's say it's a she, and she hires herself out as a cleaning lady, or if it's a young man, maybe he's working on a construction crew.
Right.
His human capital hasn't changed. He's merely crossed an invisible border called the United States-Mexican border, and suddenly his standard of living is transformed effectively, I think, by the knowledge around him that he taps into, but not in any direct way. He doesn't leverage that knowledge. What's going on there?
What does it mean, leverage that knowledge? I mean,
let's start with the simplest question. He makes more money, or she makes more money here than there.
Right.
Why? Same person, same human capital. What's changed by crossing that invisible border?
Well, let me imagine this guy, this Mexican kid, is working as a dishwasher at a Chicago restaurant. That'd be an entry job, or maybe a busboy job. And no English is required. You can learn how to do the job in half a day. You know, anyone's got the training to do it. What they're doing is cooperating with other people and capital in producing, restaurant meals for people in Chicago. Now, how productive you are in that enterprise depends. You can't do it all by yourself if you're a busboy. So it depends on the quality of the waiters you're working with, the cooks, the decor, the design of the restaurant. Anything that influences how much people are going to pay for that dinner is going to be what your pay comes out of as a busboy. So you think of the busboy as one factor of production. He's combined with all other kinds of factors which are more abundant in the United States. Plus, Americans are richer, so they're willing to pay more for a restaurant dinner than some people could in Mexico.
Right, and some of that is, it's very nicely said. Some of that is capital, knowledge about how to organize the physical layout of a kitchen with various appliances, et cetera, that make that restaurant profitable that it would not be in Mexico City.
Right.
But a lot of it's just that pure complementarity with those other skills. I think it's just very beautiful and interesting that the same worker. The other way I think about it is that I like to think I'm smarter than my dad, but my IQ probably isn't any higher. Could be lower.
Right.
And yet my standard of living is much higher. And in fact, if you go back a few generations, people, of course, knew many more things that we know nothing about.
Right.
How to skin it, skin a cow or slaughter a cow, all kinds of specific forms of knowledge we don't have to think about because others have either learned it for us or we have machines that do it for us. Right.
The other thing is how many people are competing with you at your level. So you can get a job being a busboy in a Mexico City restaurant, and there are plenty of outstanding restaurants in Mexico City where the price of the meal is going to be at least as much as it is in Chicago. But there are thousands of poor Mexicans who would work in that, who are competing with you for that busboy job, and that wage rate gets driven down to the level of some unskilled agricultural worker, I suppose. Up here in Chicago, most people, no high school graduate is going to take a job like that. I mean, it's just there's better opportunities out there for you.
Some Americans worry that Mexican worker will take that job away, or at least compete with the high school dropout and drive down the wages. People have tried to measure that, and there's disputes about it empirically. What are your thoughts on that?
It's got to be true to some extent.
So what do you think we ought to do about it?
Look, we ought to encourage people not to drop out of school. I mean, we can't set up our economy to what's good about the U.S. economy is it offers people opportunities to move up in the world. Now, some people take those opportunities and some people don't. Maybe some people don't even get them, but don't drop out of high school. I don't think we want to set up the economy to make high school dropouts protected from economic privation. It's just you don't make much money if you're a high school dropout, and that's just the way it's going to be. Now, if we didn't offer high school education to people in general, that might be a problem. But I don't, maybe we ought to we'd certainly be better off with better schools in low-income areas But even if, no matter how good they are, some people are going to take advantage of them and some people aren't. This has always been true in the heydays of American immigration 100 years ago, when people were, coming over by the millions every year. And I suppose you could, for most Native Americans, it was a plus to have these guys here, but I suppose for some it was a negative.
But the long run impact is even better, of course. I think when you look at the incredible dynamism that those immigrants add to the overall economy that we've touched on indirectly when we're talking about the cities as places of ferment and creativity.
I mean, nobody now is looking back and saying, my family would be a lot better off if we hadn't admitted all those Italians and Jews and Poles and so on in 1900.
There are a few, but they don't get a lot of airtime.
Okay.
They send me emails every once in a while, but you're right. The average American does think it was basically a good thing to let those folks come here. Just to finish off this discussion of growth, what are the puzzles that we don't understand that you think people will be working on over the next 10, 20 years in trying to understand growth?
That's a tough one. At any point in time, I always think I understand everything. And then it's only 10 years later that I have to admit that 10 years ago I didn't know a damn thing, and I've learned it all since. It's always hard for me to answer questions like that. It's a hard question to think about the transition between how did the Industrial Revolution ever get going? There was Ricardo and Malthus thought the basic dynamics of an economy were driven by fertility and demography. So if income went up, people would have more kids and drive the income per person down to restore some old equilibrium. And that's been true for centuries in most parts of the world, in all parts of the world before the 18th century. Now, at some point that ceased to be true. People got more income, and instead of having more kids, they just had more money per child. And that transition had to occur before economic growth was possible. Those same forces are still working in places like South Asia and Africa. Africa produces a lot more now than it did at 1960, but the population has grown more or less at the same rate, and living standards in Africa haven't improved. So this demographic transition has to occur, and I don't think it's a very well understood phenomenon. But we all did it. So the Africans will figure it out too.
I hope so. They might need some better political institutions before.
Well, yeah. I mean, they got to be. Yeah, exactly.
Let's switch gears. I'd like you to talk about an area that you've made just extraordinary contributions in, business cycle theory and macroeconomics generally. I want to start with a quote that you. I think it's an aside in the Lectures on Growth book. He said, in general, I believe that the importance of financial matters is very badly overemphasized in popular and even much professional discussion. And in your Nobel Prize lecture, you talk really eloquently about the history of the way economists, starting going back to Hume, thought about and think about the role of money in our macroeconomic health.
Right. What
have we learned about that, and what's left to learn?
Well, I think we learned a lot, and I've learned a lot. Monetary instability, changes in the quantity of money, especially sudden changes, seem to cause problems in an economy. They seem to be disruptive, and yet, from the theoretical point of view, you could say, well, it's just a change of units. What does it matter whether I'm talking about measuring something in yen or dollars or euros, or what happens?
Thousands of dollars.
Why do we care if the value of the dollar changes over time? But somehow we do. So a lot of business cycle work focused on the disruptive effects of monetary policy or bad monetary policy or the banking system. But I think as in the post-war period, and I think of the work of Kidlin and Prescott and other people, that we overestimated the importance of these monetary disturbances relative to just erratic changes in productivity and other real factors, and that the monetary instability is a very minor source of instability in say the modern U.S. or European or Japanese economies. Now, one way of putting that is, well, okay, we've learned how to do it right, and if we went back to monetary policies of the 1930s, we might end up with 1930s level depression. So that could be true, but one way or another, we got the story right. The modern recessions are nothing. You can't even. Nobody can even remember. Ask people to ask. Were we getting a depression or a boom when I graduated from high school or when I got married? No one can even remember. There's such minor wrinkles in the general scheme of things.
Yeah, people often forget that the Great Depression unemployment was 25%.
Right.
We get worried now when it goes up to 6 from
right.
4, and obviously for some people it creates hardship. But the magnitude of economic calamity has just totally changed in the last 50 years.
Right.
Your work and your assessment of the work of others is to focus on, when we do focus on the monetary side, is to focus on the difference between anticipated and unanticipated changes.
Right.
Do you still think those distinctions are important?
Oh, I think I could find episodes where they were. The beautiful analysis of the end of the wartime hyperinflations that Tom Sargent conducted, where inflation was suddenly brought from enormous levels to zero, and yet no depression followed. It was just a painless. And Sargent attributes that to the fact that they were anticipated, but it's proved to be damned hard to get business cycles of any size generated by inflationary surprises. It just doesn't seem to be there in the data. So I think that's an idea that had its day, and we've moved on.
And then at the current level. That could be, as you say, because we've gotten better at it, or just because they're not so effective.
I mean, I'm not saying that monetary policy is not important. Monetary policy is the source of inflation, and inflation is important. I think inflation right now, and inflation we had in the 70s, caused way more damage than any post-war recession. So inflation is a bad thing, and there's no excuse for letting it happen. And we all know how to use monetary policy and how to prevent it from happening. So that's a big plus. But the real side, the changes in employment, economic growth, those sorts of things, they don't seem to depend very intimately on monetary policy. That's my current view. And
tying this to our earlier discussion, if we want to increase living standards either within an economy or across economies, we're going to have to look elsewhere. We're going to have to look at things that increase knowledge and how to apply it in useful ways.
Productivity is everything.
Yeah, for sure. If you say we understand that monetary policy, if you were, you think then being head of the Fed is a relatively unchallenging job? I want to push you on your statement about financial matters are overemphasized. Did you mean by that the credit that people give to Greenspan and potentially to others for guiding us through this challenge? Is that what you're talking about?
Running an economy, a modern capitalist economy, is a pretty good machine without a lot of fine-tuning or management at the top. You can make trouble at the top, but if Greenspan the economy grew at about the same rate over the Greenspan years. It has grown in every 20-year period since the Civil War. So everybody's these aren't miracles that have to be engineered by extraordinary people who only come along every now and then. It's the natural course of affairs in the U.S. economy. And when something bad happens, like the Depression of the 1930s, then you look and say, okay, this was a bad decade.
Yeah. Who messed up?
Somebody must have screwed up.
Yeah.
But I'm happy Greenspan did a good job. He didn't screw up. Bernanke's not going to do it either. He's doing a great job. So are the people running the European Central Bank. So are the people of the Bank of Japan. All the advanced countries are doing a reasonable job of controlling inflation, and that's what they're there for. So I'm happy. I'm very happy that economists of the Bernanke level of quality are in positions of authority at the Federal Reserve System. There are plenty of people who shouldn't be. That says, but I'm saying that if we get a good economist, he's going to get it right, and inflation's not going to be a problem. In that sense, I think it's easy.
Well, let me ask you about a comment that Milton Friedman made in an earlier podcast. I asked him about Greenspan and others who always talk about controlling interest rates.
Yeah.
He said, well, that's what they say they do, but what they actually do is they try to really affect the level of the money supply.
Well, nobody talks in those terms anymore, but
they don't talk that way. But what do you think? What do you think of that comment?
Well, the way you lower the funds rate is by putting more reserves into the system, increasing the stock of high-powered money, people call it, and you raise interest rates by selling bonds and pulling money out of the system. So the interest rate movements that are settled at the Open Market Committee, when they arrive at a decision, they're arriving at a decision about what to do in the federal funds market by way of moving reserves into the system or out of the system. So yeah, that's what Milton means.
But they don't talk about it that way.
No.
Why do you think?
Well, bankers have always talked about interest rates. That's their living, and in most historical periods, the bankers ran the Federal Reserve System. It's only recently that economists have started to have the predominant influence in running the Federal Reserve System. That's I would view that as one of Milton Friedman's achievements, is to convince people that central banking is too important to be left to the bankers.
Yeah, I guess it's pretty rare that people entrust anything to economists. I hadn't really thought about it. That is a...
No, economists are running the world now. I mean, you just look around you. It used to be that knowing economics disqualified you for a position in the Treasury Department. Now you get Larry Summers and John Taylor, really eminent economists having positions of authority in the Treasury Department.
Interesting. We don't get much input into designing healthcare policy, though.
That's why the Clintons blew their chance to reform the insurance system, is because they didn't get anybody. There are plenty of good economists, Democratic economists, who could have helped them redesign our health insurance system. They just didn't consult them.
Yeah, well, the politics were different.
Yeah,
they had other fish to fry. It's just interesting that at the level of the central bank that those politics are not quite as dominant, maybe. Well, we're almost out of time. I'd like you to talk about Milton Friedman, who we just mentioned,
mm-hmm.
and his influence on you and your work.
Right. Well, I don't know if your class, was he still teaching 301 when you were a student here?
I took his last class, but it was not 301. It was a not-for-credit seminar.
Oh, okay.
Where this was fall of '76,
yeah.
Right before he won the Nobel Prize, and he would stand in the front of the room, and the class was very simple. We could ask him anything we wanted.
Okay.
And we often asked him questions off the core exam, the qualifying exam, partly because we wanted to know what the answers were, and partly because we wanted to see if he knew what the answers were.
Uh-huh.
He got most of them, but he didn't get every one of them, which we found very comforting.
Okay. Well, in my day, which is I took that course in 1960, and it was a life-changing experience. It was the most excitingly, by the time you take your first course in graduate school, you've had 16 years of schooling or something like that, so you think you've seen everything. And Milton's class is it was so exciting, and every day you'd be applying economic theory, fairly simple economic theory, to a brand new problem. You'd be arguing about it for a whole class in Milton for an hour and 20 minutes, and after leaving the class, you were so stimulated. I'd work all night trying to think about what was going on in the lecture. He's a great teacher. Back then, he wasn't a famous, household word, and only people who knew that were people who took his courses at Chicago. But after a while, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and everybody in the world got in on that in a way. You saw that in this Free to Choose series. Of course, he's also a great scientist and made huge research achievements that people are still building on. But for me, this his teaching style, which is impossible to imitate, at least I gave up trying years ago. It's something I've never seen before or since.
Who else was intellectually stimulating in those days of Chicago in the 60s?
Oh, there were a lot of people doing good work. I ended up working with Arnold Harberger on he was doing some really cool work on taxation. Zvi Grillikus was a stimulating guy. There were a lot of good people. Greg Lewis was a labor economist that I took some courses with, and he really, working with him was really apprenticing. It was like my dad learning how to be a welder. I mean, you really sit down and learn your trade. It was great background.
Yeah, his name is not as well known as many from those years, but he was my understanding is he was an extraordinary mentor.
He was
of graduate students.
Gary Becker would view himself as a student of Lewis's as well as Friedman's in more or less the same way I would. So were lots of other Chicago students. I was not a particularly macro guy back in those days.
You were a history major undergraduate, right?
Well, yeah, I didn't know any economics as an undergraduate.
And why did you turn to economics? What got you interested?
I sort of thought I was sort of a pseudo-Marxist or something. I thought economic forces were what made history go. I still do, really. And so I tried to learn some economics. And, I just couldn't do. You can't just learn economics by taking out a book at the library and reading it. You have to be involved with people. So I switched over into economics, thinking I would get back to history sooner or later. I'm sort of getting there now, but it took a while.
What do you mean by that?
I'm doing more historical work now, thinking about the early days of the Industrial Revolution.
My guest today is Robert Lucas, the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. This is Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more Econ Talk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for Econ Talk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.